Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew. In this class, we're going to be looking at how to sew a V-neck sleeveless A-line dress with a loose lining and inseam pockets. Now, this is class 2 of a series where I'm showing you how to draft and then sew this garment. Now, you can choose to make this in a short length above the knee, or you could choose to make this in a longer length. You could also choose to add sleeves if you wanted to. Now, I've chosen to make my dresses in a linen or a cotton material, perfect for warm weather and summer. However, if you want to make a winter or autumnal version, you could choose to make one in a wool or potentially even a boucle tweed, something like that. You could choose to wear a thin jumper underneath, such as a roll neck, tights, boots, and you have a nice winter garment. In this class, we're going to be focusing on solely the construction of the dress. I'm going to be going through step by step how to sew and make it in a professional manner. I will be teaching you how to do an invisible zipper with a lining, a loose lining, how to finish the armholes and the neckline with the lining, how to install a facing in the hem, and inseam pockets. I'll also be linking off to other more detailed tutorials as and when if you need them. In this class, I'm going to be using an overlocker or serger for finishing the edges of my material. If you don't have access to one of those, then you could do an overcast stitch on the sewing machine, you could use pinking shears, or you could even just sew a different seam, such as a French seam. So grab the material that you want to work with and your pattern that you can draft in class 1 if you're interested, and we can get started.
Let's start by working through the pattern pieces that you need to cut out in your material, both your external fabric and your lining. You will have a front pattern piece in your exterior fabric. This can be cut as one piece on the fold, or you can choose to cut it with a centre front seam, on the straight of grain or on the bias. You should have two exterior back pattern pieces. These can be cut with the grain line aligned with the centre back or on the bias. If you're working to cut your garments on the bias, I recommend that you follow this bias layout. In your exterior material, you will also need to have a back hem facing and a front hem facing. These are cut on the fold or as one piece for the back and one piece for the front. When it comes to your pocket bags, you will need to have two pocket bags cut in your exterior material and two pocket bags cut in your lining material. And finally, for your lining, you will have a front lining. This can be cut on the fold or with a centre front seam, on the straight of grain or on the bias, just like your exterior material. And two pattern pieces for the back, cut with the grain line parallel to the centre back or on the bias. Mark any notches or details you require on your garment. Once you've cut out your pattern pieces, you're going to want to begin by doing some preparation and interfacing the pieces where they require it. It's really important to do this straight away so that you don't handle your material and create any stretching or distortion in the fabric. The centre front exterior fabric will need to have the neckline stay stitched or taped with a stabilising iron-on interfacing. I'm working with an interfacing that is a bias strip with a row of stitching through it. This row of stitching should be sitting directly on top of your stitching line. For the V-neck, I have applied two pieces, one to either side of the V-neck with a join at the centre front. If you're stay stitching the neckline at the sewing machine, I would still recommend applying a small piece of lightweight interfacing to the bottom of the V at the neckline. This will help to support the neckline when we cut in nice and close to the bottom of the V. This same fusible tape can also be used around the armholes in the front, the back neckline, and the armholes in the back. I have a tutorial on stabilising curves using this tape, and I'll pop a link to it in the description box below. As well as stabilising the curves, you will also need to stabilise other areas of the garment. For the front and the back, you're going to want to stabilise where the pocket will be inserted. I'm using a strip of interfacing cut on the straight of. You can cut your own, or you can purchase it in a 2 cm, 3/4 of an inch width, like I've got here. This piece of interfacing should be aligned to the edge of the material and past the notches for the pocket placement by approximately 1 cm, 3/8 of an inch above and below the pocket. You should also tape the centre back, as this is where the zipper is going to be inserted. Again, I'm working with a tape that measures 2 cm, 3/4 of an inch in width, and I will place this from the top neckline of the garment all the way down the centre back, stopping 2 centimetres, 3/4 of an inch below the notch for the end of the zipper. Finally, I'm going to interface the hem facings, both the front and the back. And I'm using a lightweight, stable woven interfacing to do this. This will add a little bit of body and support the hem of the garment. Once you have interfaced and prepared your garment, we can then move on to start the sewing. I will begin by sewing the darts. You need to mark the stitching line for the darts, and you can do this with your choice of marking technique. You could use carbon paper and a tracing wheel, or if you've got a cutaway dart like I have here, I'm simply going to measure with my ruler 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, which is my seam allowance, away from the cut edge, and draw this on with chalk. If I extend these lines, they will join together to create my dart point. I can then work to pin the lines together and take my work to the sewing machine to sew my darts. Although these are cutaway darts, which means that the bulk in the centre of the dart has been removed, simply because of how large they are, I'm going to sew them like a normal dart, matching the 2 stitching lines together. I will sew from the side seam towards the dart point. At the dart point, I will sew off the material and complete a small back stitch. If you have a cutaway dart like I do, it's a good idea to finish the raw edges of that dart on an overlocker or serger. I'm going to run my dart through my overlocker, aligning the stitching line of the dart with the marker for the left needle. I only have the right needle in my overlocker. This will result in the overlocking stitching being about 1/8 of an inch, 2 to 3 millimeters away from the original dart stitching. Ensure that you leave a long tail of thread as you sew off the overlocker. Press your dart flat, and then we can work to tidy away the overlocking thread at the point of the dart. Find a large-eyed sewing needle or darning needle. Trim the overlocking thread to make it easier to thread the needle with the overlocking thread. You can then use the needle to thread the overlocking thread back up underneath the overlocking stitching for approximately 2 to 3 centimeters, 1 inch. The needle can exit the overlocking stitching and you can trim the thread. The threads at the side seam end of the dart can simply be cut, as this edge will be finished with the overlocker shortly. Now you can work to press your dart like you normally would. I would recommend using a ham and pressing the dart in the direction of the hem. You will need to complete the same technique for both darts in your exterior fabric and both darts in your lining fabric. Once you've sewn your darts, we will move on to start assembling the pockets. You will want to finish the outside curved edge of all of the pockets, the 2 external and 2 lining pockets. And I'm going to be using my overlocker or serger for this, working my way around the outside curved edge of the pocket, making sure that I'm not cutting anything away with the blade. I'm simply finishing the raw edge of the material. It's important to try not to stretch the pocket shape here. You want to move the material and the shape of the curve through the machine as smoothly as you can. Once completed, trim your threads and give the pocket a flat press, as the overlocking may have pulled it up slightly. I like to check the pockets against one another to check that there hasn't been any stretching or distortion. The straight edge of the pocket has not yet been finished, as that will be finished once it's attached to the garment. Once you have the 4 pockets ready, the 2 exterior and the 2 lining, we can then attach them to the garment. We'll start with the front of the garment. Take your front with the right side facing up. The front of the garment is going to have the lining pocket pieces attached. Place the lining pocket pieces with the right side of the lining pocket against the right side of your front material. The straight edge of the pocket and the side seam should align and the notches should match. Pin the pockets in place on both sides. I then like to fold my garment in half to double check that the pockets are perfectly aligned and that the distance from the underarm to the top of the pocket and the pocket to the hem is the same on both sides. We will then move on to the back of the garment. And on the back of the garment, we have the pockets in the exterior material. The back of the garment needs to have the right side facing up, and you will place your pocket with the right side facing down, so the right sides are together, on top of your back. Once again, you want to align the straight edge of the pocket to the straight side seam of the garment, matching the notches. Pin in position and work to double check that both sides of the back have the pocket in the same position. Just like with the front, I'm checking from the underarm down to the top of the pocket and from the hem up to the bottom of the pocket. Before we go to the sewing machine, it's often a good idea to double check that your front and your back pockets are positioned in the right place. To do this, I will align the side seams. If there's any discrepancy at all, you will want to move your pockets. They need to be the same for when we sew the side seams together. Once you're happy, we can head to the sewing machine and we're going to sew the pockets in place onto the garment along the straight edge. Now, rather than sewing our finished seam allowance here, we're going to be sewing a seam allowance that's 1/8 of an inch, 2 to 3 millimeters smaller. So my finished seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch, 1 centimeter. I will be attaching my pocket at a distance of 1/4 of an inch, 6 millimeters from the edge of my material. This is so that the pocket will actually sit back a little bit more hidden on the finished garment. Start with a back stitch and sew along the pocket, attaching it to the garment. End with the back stitch. Complete this for all 4 pockets, your 2 fronts and your 2 backs. Once you've sewn your pocket pieces to your garment pieces, we can work to finish the side seams of the garment using the overlocker or serger. Simply overlock along the side seam of all 4 pieces, the 2 fronts and the 2 backs. You want to be finishing the raw edge of the material and not cutting anything away. Make sure that the pocket stays out of the way so that you don't accidentally cut this whilst you're overlocking. You also want to ensure that your dart is going towards the hem as you overlock over it. As well as the 4 side seams, you can also do this to the 2 centre back seams. Now you can see my back garment where I've finished overlocking the side seam that would have included the straight edge of the pocket, as well as the centre back seam. Give the overlocked or serged seams a press to ensure that they sit flat. Trim your threads and complete this for both the front and the back garment pieces. You can also work to overlock or serge the same elements of your lining at this point. That's the 2 side seams of the front and the side seams and the back seams that belong to the back pieces. You don't need to worry about overlocking anything else, such as the shoulders or the hem, as these will be contained in other seams. Now that I've finished my side seam and my centre back seam with the overlocker, I'm going to apply some edge stitching to the pocket. This is so that the pocket bag stays inside the pocket once it's been sewn. Push the pocket towards the seam allowances, and you're going to be sewing along the long edge of the pocket, a couple of millimeters, 1/8 of an inch away from the seam that joined the pocket onto the side of the garment, sewing through both the pocket and all of the seam allowances underneath. And you're going to want to do this to all 4 pockets. At the sewing machine, I'm using my edge stitching foot, which means that I can align the seam between the pocket and the garment with the front bar of my foot. I'm then going to move my needle 2 points towards the pocket, which means that I'm sewing a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch away from the seam that joins the pocket to the garment, 2 to 3 millimeters. Backstitch at the start and at the end and complete this for the length of your pocket. Now that the pockets have been edge stitched like you see here, we're going to move on in our assembly. The next step is going to be to sew the shoulder seams together. You will take your front with the right side facing up and you will lay down your back pieces with the right sides together, aligning them at the shoulders. Sew across the shoulders using your seam allowance. Mine is 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch. Backstitch at the start and at the end. You can complete this for the lining as well. Once sewn, you will want to press these seam allowances open or towards the back of the garment. Once the shoulders are sewn in the exterior and lining fabric, we're going to join the 2 materials together and sew the neckline. Place the exterior fabric with the right side facing up. Take the lining fabric with the right side facing down so the right sides of the 2 materials are together and align them around the neckline. Match the raw edges of the material together and pin in position. You need to make sure that the V is directly on top of one another, as well as the seams at the shoulders and the edge of the material at the centre back. Sewing a precise V-neck at the machine can be a little bit tricky, so I usually like to draw my V-neck on with chalk or a removable pen prior to sewing. Use your ruler to draw on your seam allowance just at the bottom section of the V. My seam allowance is 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch. You want to ensure that your shoulder seams match and stay matched whilst you're sewing. So you may find it useful to use something like this clover fork pin, which you can very carefully sew over to ensure that they match. I don't usually bother with something like this, but I know from teaching classes that these can be really useful for those of you that are learning. Position the pin in with the two legs of the pin either side of the seam that you want to match. And check with the pin in the material that you still have a perfect match between the seams of the exterior and lining material. When it comes to sewing a V-neck, I'm going to sew this in 2 passes so that I sew over the V section twice. This gives a little bit more stability and strength to that area that we're going to be cutting in close to. I'm going to start about 5 centimeters, 2 inches away from the V-neck, sew towards the V and around to the back of the neckline. I will then do exactly the same thing on the other side. If you do this, you don't necessarily need to reduce your stitch length as well. I will be sewing this at my standard 2.5mm stitch length. At the sewing machine, let's sew the first side of the V. I'm going to start sewing 5 centimeters, 2 inches away from the point of the V. I will backstitch and sew along my marked stitching line until I get to the point of the V. At the point of the V, I will position my needle into the material, raise my presser foot and turn my work. I will then continue sewing along the marked line of the V. When this ends, I will follow my seam allowance, 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch. Constantly checking that the 2 edges of the material are aligned, I will continue sewing all the way around the neckline until I get to the centre back. If you're using a clover fork pin and plan to sew over this, you need to do so very cautiously. Sew around to the centre back and backstitch to finish. I do have some more detailed tutorials about sewing V-necks and I will put links in the description box below. I then will complete the second side, sewing from the centre back all the way around the neck, back to the V. At the V, I will position my needle into the material, lift my presser foot, turn my work, and sew for another 5 centimeters, 2 inches before backstitching. If you're planning on having a centre front seam in your garment, I want to point out a couple of differences when sewing the neckline. The first important step is that when you sew the centre front of the garment, either in your exterior and or lining, wherever you have that centre front seam, you need to make sure that you stop sewing your centre front at the seam allowance for the neckline. I will usually mark my seam allowance for the neckline on with some chalk and ensure that I backstitch and stop sewing directly at this point. It needs to be accurate on both sides of your material. Then when it comes to assembling the neckline of the garment, you're going to lay the lining and your exterior material together with the right sides facing. You will match and align the rest of the neckline together. The difference is at the point of the V. You're not going to want to be sewing over the seam allowances at the point of the V. So you're going to want to push the seam allowances towards one side, position a pin directly on the meeting point of that centre front stitching line to where the stitching line for the neckline will be. This pin needs to go through to your exterior material at the exact same point. Like with the standard V-neck neckline, it can be a good idea to mark the bottom of the V with some chalk. Once you're happy the pin has entered the lining and exterior material at the right points, you can position it into the fabric. The centre front seam allowances should be out of the way on both the lining side as well as the exterior material side. It can be useful to position a pin into the material to hold them in place, out of the way whilst you're sewing. Add pins along the rest of the neckline. You may prefer to baste or tack your work to ensure that you have everything sitting correctly. When it comes to sewing, you will start sewing at the centre back. You will sew towards the shoulder. You will sew down to the point of the V-neck, stopping at the joint of the centre front seam. You must not sew over the bulk of the seam allowances. At the sewing machine, you will start sewing at the centre back with a backstitch. You will sew around the neckline towards the V. When you get to the V, you need to double check that the seam allowances of that centre front seam for both the exterior and the lining are out of the way. I'm very carefully going to be sewing towards my pin, removing the pin very cautiously as I sew towards myself. You want to stop sewing exactly at that point where the seam allowance for the neckline meets the seam allowance for the centre front. Raise your presser foot and double check this if you need to. Backstitch, 3 to 4 stitches, sew forwards again and backstitch again. Make sure that you are being accurate. This is what my finished seam will look like. There is a small gap between my neck stitching and my centre front stitching, and that's okay, as long as this is not larger than a stitch length. On completion of the sewing, check your work. Check that you don't have any puckers or caught material around the neckline. Check that the shoulder seams of both the exterior and the lining are aligned and match. Once you're happy, you're going to want to cut into the center of the V. You need to cut really nice and close to your stitching, about a 1/16 of an inch, 2 millimeters away. You can then work to press the seam allowances open up to the V. This can be a nice way to get a really professional finish around your neckline. If you have seam allowances that are larger than 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch, or if you have fabric that is bulky, you are welcome to trim and or grade your seam allowances here. If you're grading your seam allowances, you will want to trim the lining seam allowance to be the smallest. With my material choices and my 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, I'm not going to trim my seam allowances here. Turn your work to the right side and check that you are happy with everything prior to proceeding. You want to make sure that the V point is nice and sharp and that the back neckline curve, when turned to the right side, is sitting nice and flat. Depending on the shape of your curves, you may need to cut into the curves of the seam allowance to release the material here. This involves cutting a straight snip into the seam allowance towards the stitching line. You can do this through both layers of material at the same time, or you can stagger them, cutting through the lining and the exterior material separately. Once happy, we're going to go to the sewing machine to understitch. We're going to push both of the seam allowances towards the lining, even though we press them open. We're going to be sewing on the lining, approximately a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch, 2 to 3 millimeters away from the seam that joined the lining to the exterior material at the neckline. We're going to start sewing 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge of the center back of the garment. This is so that we have space to insert our invisible zipper later on. I'm using my edge stitching foot again as a guide, aligning the center bar of the edge stitching foot with the seam between the lining and the exterior material. I have then moved my needle 2 places towards my lining. This allows me to sew an accurate distance away from the seam in my lining. You can use a foot or move your needle as it works best with your sewing machine. As I work around the neckline, I'm going to give a little bit of tension between the exterior material and the lining to make sure that my material is nice and flat as I sew. I'm also consistently checking that both seam allowances are going in the direction of the lining. Once you get to the point of the V, you may need to give both layers of material a little bit of a gentle pull to make sure that they're nice and flat as you sew over them. Then you will continue sewing around the neckline until you get back to the opposite centre back seam. On the other centre back, you're going to want to stop the exact same distance that you started away from the centre back. Mine was 1.5 centimetres, 5/8 of an inch. You can measure this and mark it if you want to. Backstitch to secure. We can now give the neckline a nice press in this finished position. I will press from the lining side, making sure that I can see a small amount of the exterior fabric all the way along the neckline. At the point of the V, you may need to give your lining material a little bit of a pull as you press it to make sure that you end up with a nice flat finish to the point of the V. Check that you're happy with the V shape from the front and that you have a nice sharp finish. Then we're going to work to finish the armholes. To do this, we need to bring the lining material back around so that the right side of the lining is against the right side of the exterior, just like you had it when you were sewing the neckline of the garment. Once you have the right side of the exterior and the right side of the lining together, you can work to pin the armholes in place. You're going to want to match the 2 shoulder seams between the exterior and the lining fabric again, aligning the side seams under the arms for both the front and the back, pinning the rest of the armhole material so that the raw edges match. If you have any discrepancy between the 2 layers, you need to ease the fabrics together, remembering that your exterior fabric has been stay stitched, so this should be correct. Place in your pins as required. We're going to sew from one side seam around the armhole up and over the shoulder and back down the other armhole to the other side seam. If you used a clover fork pin for the shoulder of the neck, you may want to use that again for the shoulder here. Complete the same process, pinning both armholes. Then we can head to the sewing machine. At the sewing machine, you are going to backstitch, sew along the length of the armhole following your seam allowance. Mine is 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. Sew over the shoulder seam. If you're using a clover pin, do be cautious and sew very slowly. When you get to the end of the armhole, you will backstitch. Complete this for both armholes. Now we have the armholes sewn together, so the exterior and the lining material are joined at the armhole. We can check that we're happy with our sewing. checking that we haven't caught any of the material and that our seam allowances are accurate everywhere. It's also a good idea to double check that the shoulder seams are on top of one another. If they're not, you can unpick this section and re-sew them now. The next thing that we're going to need to do here is to clip into the curves. This will ensure that when we turn the curves around to the right side, they sit nicely. Cut a straight line at a right angle to the stitching line in on the fullest part of the curves. You can cut through the materials together or cut the exterior and the lining materials separately, staggering them. This can help to reduce a weak spot. You're also welcome to trim your seam allowances and grade them if you need to. A reminder that the lining seam allowance should be the smallest. Again, with my lightweight material and 1 cm 3/8 seam allowance, I'm going to leave them as they are. We can now work to turn this garment around to the right side. To do this, you're going to want to take your hand and place it between the 2 layers of material on the front of the garment. This will be in between the right side of the exterior and the right side of the lining. Reach up towards the shoulder seam. Using your other hand, you're going to want to push the back exterior and lining material towards the front. Grab hold of the back exterior and lining material, pulling it through the shoulder seam to the front of the garment. Once you have one side with the right side facing out, you can then do exactly the same for the other side. Check that your work isn't twisted and that everything is now with the right side facing out. At this stage, we could choose to understitch our armholes. However, I usually find that it's easiest to sew the side seams next, and then we'll head back to understitching once the side seams are connected. To sew the side seams, you're going to want to take the exterior front and the exterior back and position them with the right sides of the material together. I usually start by matching the underarm seam, the join between the exterior and the lining, sending the armhole seam allowances towards the lining. I'm then going to work down from the underarm to the top of the pocket, matching the pocket notches for the front and the back. Remember that the pocket bags will be an extension of the garment going away from the side seam. I can then work from the bottom pocket notch down towards the hem. You can position your pins in roughly to start with and then make them more precise. Once the exterior of the garment is pinned together, you're going to want to move on to the lining, matching the front to the back, the right sides of the lining together. Now that everything is connected neatly, I'm going to add a few more pins to my pocket bags. I have my exterior and my lining pocket bags connected with the right sides together. We're going to sew starting at the lining hem and completing a backstitch all the way down to the join between the lining and the exterior material at the underarm. We will then sew to the top of the pocket, position in our needle, pivot and turn our work, sew around the pocket, back to that bottom pocket corner, position the needle in, turn our work and sew to the garment hem. We will backstitch to finish. It's generally a good idea to add some pins across the pocket opening. I usually position my pins in so that the pin is going in on the previous pocket stitching, and I'm checking that the pin is going through to the other side on the same stitching. This just makes sure that the pockets are positioned directly on top of each other. To make it easy to sew around the pocket opening, I will usually draw some marks on. I'm going to draw a chalk mark on in line with my pocket notch at both the top of the pocket and the bottom of the pocket. This is my seam allowance, 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch, in from my pocket. You may find it easier to draw on the stitching line for these corners of your pocket, and you can do that with chalk or a removable pen. To ensure a perfect match at the underarm seam and the join between the lining and the exterior material, you can use a clover fork pin again. Once you've prepared the first side, you can work to prepare the second side. Make sure when you're preparing the second side that you plan to sew the garment side seams in the same direction, meaning if you started with the lining hem on the first side, you will want to start with the lining hem on the second side. Just to note, I usually sew my garments from the hem of the garment up. However, with pockets like this, it doesn't really matter whether you sew from the lining or from the garment hem. The key here is to ensure that your hems match at both ends. I usually turn my work around to the right side to double check everything prior to heading to the sewing machine. At the sewing machine, we can begin with a backstitch. It doesn't matter if you start sewing on the lining or on the exterior garment hem. Sew along the material following your seam allowance. Mine is 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. As you sew over your darts, make sure that they're pressed in the right direction. Sew over the join at the armhole. The seam allowances must be going towards the lining. When you get to the pockets, you're going to position your needle in on your marked point or at the pocket notch. Turn your work. You can sew the corner area about 2 centimetres, 3/4 of an inch either side of the corner at a reduced stitch length of 1.5 millimetres to reinforce the opening. Alternatively, you can add some other reinforcement steps once the pocket is sewn. I will discuss these shortly. Sew around the pocket, keeping the same seam allowance. When you get back to the other side of the pocket and the pocket notch, you will once again position your needle into the material and turn your work. You can then proceed to finish sewing the side seam of the garment, backstitching when you get to the end. Complete this for both sides. On completion, check that you're happy with your sewing and that you've stopped and started at the exact same point for your pocket on both sides of your garment. Check that you're happy with the join between the lining and the exterior material at the underarm. Turn your work around to the right side and double check everything. Using a seam roll, work to press the seam allowances of the exterior material towards the front. You're welcome to press them open first if you need to. Finish by pressing the pocket flat, going towards the front of the garment. For the lining seam allowances, you can press them towards the front of the garment as well, although that can increase the amount of bulk because both seam allowances are going in the same direction. So, I will usually press my lining seam allowance towards the back instead, and the seam allowances will change direction from the front to the back at the armhole area. This can either happen naturally, or you can choose to snip into the seam allowances at a right angle, about 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch below the armhole. When you snip in, make sure that you don't cut any more than 5 millimetres, a scant 1/4 of an inch, because you don't want to weaken this seam. This area will be hidden by anchoring our seams at the bust darts once the dress is complete. Check your pocket from the right side of the garment. Look at the front pocket, where you have a difference between the lining pocket bag and the exterior material. You want to have the same distance between the lining pocket bag and the folded edge of the pocket all the way along the pocket opening. If this isn't even, you may not have pressed your pocket completely flat in the seam, and you may want to tweak it from the right side of the garment or the inside of the pocket. If you sewed your pocket at a standard stitch length of 2.5 millimetres, it can be a good idea to add some reinforcement to the pocket opening. You can do this in the form of a bar tack on the right side of the garment. You would do this at the top and bottom opening of the pocket. I decided that I didn't want the look of a bar tack on this particular garment, so I'm going to go to the inside of the pocket to add my reinforcement instead. I'm going to sew over the corner stitching of the pocket, 2 centimetres, 3/4 of an inch either side of the corner. I'm going to do this at my sewing machine with my standard 2.5 millimetre stitch length. This is only required if you sew your initial pocket at 2.5 millimetres. As suggested in the pocket sewing, if you reduced your stitch length to 1.5 millimetres around the corners, you would not need to sew over yourself. I will start with the back stitch, sew up to the corner, position my needle in the material, turn the work, and sew away from the corner, aiming for about 2 centimetres, 3/4 of an inch distance either side of the corner. And I will complete this for both corners on both pockets. Now that the pockets and side seams have been finished, we can move on to understitching the armhole, just like we did for the neckline. To understitch the armhole, we need to push the seam allowances between the body and the lining at the armhole towards the lining. We're going to be sewing on the lining, catching these seam allowances, exactly the same as with the neckline. Make sure that you have your underarm seam allowances for the side seam going in the right direction. Depending on what you've chosen, my lining is going towards the back. It's usually easiest to understitch your armhole in 2 passes, starting at the underarm seam. You will sew up towards the shoulder seam, stopping about 5 centimetres, 2 inches away from the shoulder seam on both sides. So you will sew from the underarm seam up towards the shoulder seam on the one side, and then again from the underarm seam up towards the shoulder seam on the second side. At the sewing machine, I'm starting with my needle directly into that underarm seam, and I'm going to complete a back stitch, but I want to keep my back stitching to a minimum here. 1, 2 stitches maximum. I'm using my edge stitching foot, and I have moved my needle 2 places towards my lining. I'm using the same distance that I used on my neckline for consistency, aiming for about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch, 2 to 3 millimeters away from the seam between the lining and exterior material. As I'm sewing around the armhole, I'm constantly checking that I'm only sewing on the lining and that I'm catching those seam allowances underneath the lining. You also need to be cautious in this tight area that you don't accidentally sew anything else. From the top of the work, I am pulling ever so slightly between the layers of the lining and the exterior material so that I get a nice flat finish. As you work up towards the shoulder and you have less space, it gets a little bit trickier. You will usually be able to get about 5 centimeters, 2 inches away from the shoulder seam, but please sew as far as you feel comfortable. You may not be able to achieve the same as me, and that might be based on the shape of your garment. Just try and be consistent with both sides. Backstitch to secure. And then you will go and complete the second side, starting at the underarm seam, moving the needle in the opposite direction, and sewing up towards the armhole, aiming to stop the same distance away from that shoulder seam. Just like with the neckline, once you've completed your understitching, you can press the armhole in position. I'm always pressing this from the wrong side of my garment, so the lining side in this case, and I'm making sure that I've got a very small amount of the exterior garment peeking around the edge of the armhole. This means that you won't see my lining from the right side of the garment. Once you've finished understitching both armholes, we can move on to finishing the centre back seam and inserting our invisible zipper. You can use your preferred method to insert the invisible zipper into the exterior material. You can insert the zipper first and then sew the centre back seam below the zipper, or you can choose to sew that seam first. I'm going to follow this method, but I would rather that you went ahead and inserted your invisible zipper in a method that you felt comfortable with. I'm going to separate my lining and my exterior material so that I can position the exterior material together with the right side of the backs facing one another. I'm matching from the hem up to the notch for the bottom of my zipper. The same with my lining. I have the right sides of the two backs positioned together. And I'm working to pin from the hem up to the notch for the bottom of the zipper. At the sewing machine, I'm going to sew from the hem up to the notch for the bottom of the zipper, where I will backstitch. I will do this for both the lining and the exterior material, sewing following my 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. On completion, you will want to press the seam allowances open using a seam roll for both the exterior material and the lining. I've gone ahead and pressed under the seam allowances belonging to my back in my exterior fabric. You don't need to do this step. I was doing this so that I could double check how my pattern matching would look once my zipper was inserted. As you can see, I've aimed for my zipper to be inserted in between the polka dots so that I don't have to have a join of a polka dot along my centre back seam, which would be a little bit trickier for me to sew. Unfasten your invisible zipper. It doesn't matter which side of the zipper you start with. I'm going to take the right side of my zipper and I'm going to place this with the right side of the zip against the right side of my material. The zipper teeth will go towards the garment, whereas the edge of the zipper tape should align with the raw edge of your centre back. Position the top plastic stopper of the zip about 1/8 of an inch, 2 to 3 millimeters away from the folded top edge of the neckline. This is probably not the seam between your lining and your exterior material because of the small amount of favouring that you might be able to see from your exterior material on your lining side. Pin the zipper into position for the first side. Depending on your zip tape width and the size of your seam allowance, you may be able to align the edge of the zipper tape directly with the edge of your seam allowance. However, it's worth checking and you want to ensure that you're positioning the teeth of the zipper on top of your stitching line. It can be useful to draw your stitching line onto your fabric with chalk or a removable pen. At the sewing machine, you're going to want to start sewing just above the plastic zip stopper. Make sure that the top of the zipper tape is out of the way, as well as the neck seam allowances. They should be going towards the lining. At the sewing machine, I'm going to use my invisible zipper foot to sew my zipper in place. When I use my invisible zipper foot, I usually move my needle 1 or 2 places towards my zipper teeth. This helps me to sew a little bit closer to the teeth and to get a better finish from the right side of the garment. If you want to try this, I would recommend that you do a test with your invisible zipper foot on your individual zipper and fabric. You don't want to sew too close to the zipper that you can't fasten it. Sew along the length of the zipper. until you get to the centre back seam that you've previously sewn. I usually pass the centre back seam that I've previously sewn, attaching my zipper onto the seam allowances by about 1/4 inch, 5mm. Backstitch to secure. I then fasten my zipper and double check my work. Fold the material in at the top of the zipper to check that you're happy with where it's finishing. Check the bottom of the zipper. If you're happy, you can work to pin the second side of the zip. As I mentioned before, it does not matter which side you do first. If you're pattern matching like I am here, you may wish to hand sew your zipper first prior to sewing it at the machine, just to ensure that you get a perfect match. If you're not pattern matching, you will want to align the top of the zipper to the exact same point as the first side. I usually fasten my zipper to double check this prior to sewing it. Sew along the second side of the zipper using your invisible zipper foot and moving your needle if you did for the first side. When you get to the centre back seam, you will once again want to sew the zipper onto the seam allowances past this by about 1/4 inch, 5mm. At the bottom of the zip, push the zipper pull through so that you can fasten it. Check your work. If you need to give your zipper a press, I like to use pieces of card positioned underneath the zipper to ensure that you don't get any embossing on the right side of the garment. Anchor the bottom of the zipper onto the seam allowances. Take one side of the zipper and pin through onto one side of the seam allowance. Make sure that you don't go through to the right side of the fabric. We're only attaching it to the seam allowances. Do the same for the other side of the zip. At the sewing machine, you're going to complete a bar tack, 3 to 4 stitches forwards and backwards a couple of times to secure the zipper onto the seam allowances. Do not sew through to the right side of the material, only attach the zip to the seam allowances. Now that the bottom of the zipper has been attached to the seam allowances, we're going to work to connect the lining to the inside of the zipper. Undo the zipper on your garment. Open out the zipper tape so that you have the raw edge of the centre back material going towards the outside of the garment, in the same manner that you would have sewn the zipper onto the garment. Take the back lining and pull this around so that it folds at the neckline edge, positioning what will be the right side of the lining against the zipper and the right side of your exterior fabric, aligning the very edge of the centre back lining with the edge of the centre back exterior material. This might be aligned with the edge of your zipper tape, or it might not be, depending on the width of your zipper tape and your seam allowances. The zip I'm using in this garment is not a brand that I would usually use. My preference is YKK, but I couldn't get the colour that I needed. So my zipper tape is slightly wider than my seam allowance. Now you will work to pin this down the length of the zipper, but let's firstly focus at the top neck edge of the zip and how to create a perfect finish here. You're going to need to pull the zipper tape above the top zip stopper until the once vertical part of the zipper tape is horizontal, sitting along the neckline edge. This will keep the zipper tape out of the way whilst we're sewing and ensure that we don't have any added bulk in this area. With the zipper tape held in position like this, fold the lining at the neck seam, matching the right side of the lining to the right side of your exterior material and the zipper tape. The seam allowances along the neck edge should go towards the lining. Place a pin to hold it in position. Then I like to carefully turn the work around to the right side so that I can check this top corner. Ideally, you want to have a clean finish to the top of the zipper. You do not want to be able to see the folded zipper tape from the inside of the garment, and the neck seam should be finishing neatly along the neck edge. Once you're happy with the top corner, you can then work to pin the lining the rest of the way down the zipper. For the bottom of the zipper, you will just keep pinning the lining to the zipper tape until you get to the centre back seam of the lining. Complete this seam using your standard zipper foot. I'm aligning the edge of the zipper foot with the zipper teeth, moving my needle so that I'm sewing approximately 3 to 5mm, a generous 1/8 of an inch to a scant 1/4 of an inch away from the zipper teeth. Due to the bulk, it can be tricky to start sewing at the top of this seam. If your sewing machine struggles, start away from the neck edge, sew the length of the seam, and then return to sew the top portion of the seam, sewing in a different direction. Sew down the length of the seam, attaching the lining onto the zipper. You will get to a point where you can't sew any further, and this is because your invisible zipper is currently open. In order to sew the remaining section of the lining onto the zipper, you're going to need to fasten the zip. To do this, you want to position your needle into the fabric, raise the presser foot, and fasten your zipper. When I continue sewing, I will keep the edge of my zipper foot against my zipper teeth, sewing all the way along until I reach the center back seam in the lining. You want to finish before or in line with this center back seam. You will not be joining up with this seam because you're sewing a slightly different seam allowance. Backstitch to secure. If you had trouble with the bulk at the start of the seam, at that neck edge, then I just recommend that you position this back through the sewing machine, sewing from where you started sewing to the neck edge, securing with a backstitch. It will be much easier sewing it in this direction. Of course, you will need to move your needle as you'll be using the opposite side of the zipper foot. Check the stitching along the work. You want to check that you haven't got any pleats or puckers anywhere. Before we continue, it's a good idea to check the top of the zipper. Fold the zipper towards the exterior fabric and turn the work around to the right side, poking out the corner. You can use a point turner if you need to. You should have a nice flat corner that isn't too bulky. You should not be able to see the folded zipper tape on the wrong side of the garment. If your work is really bulky, you can choose to trim or grade your seam allowances. It's a good idea to fasten the zipper to check that you're happy with this top corner. If you're happy with this top corner, then I recommend you double check the rest of the lining and how that's been sewn to the zip, just in case you have any pleats or puckers. If you're happy, we can then move to the second side. The second side is completed in exactly the same way as the first side. I recommend that you start by folding and pinning the top corner. Again, it's a good idea to check this from the right side, and I like to do this by fastening my zipper as well. You want to check with the zip fastened that the top edge of the zipper or both neck edges are in line across the center back. Once happy with this top corner, you can then proceed to pin the rest of the lining down the length of the zipper. You will need to give your lining a bit of a tug so that you have access to it now that it's been sewn onto the other side of the zipper. Pin this all the way down to that center back seam in your lining, just like you did for the first side. When it comes to sewing the second side, you're going to complete it exactly the same. Sewing that same distance away, and once again sewing all the way to that bottom center back seam in your lining. Fasten the zipper and check your work from both the right side and the wrong side. Check the inside of the garment and where the lining is finishing. It can be a good idea to press the lining away from the zipper on the inside of the garment. Once you're happy with how your zipper is looking, we can proceed to the next step of the garment, finishing the hem. Take the back and the front hem facings and position them with the right sides together, aligning what is the side seam. Position in some pins as we're going to take these to the sewing machine and sew the side seams. At the sewing machine, you're going to sew this like a normal seam, backstitching at the start and at the end, sewing with your seam allowance. Mine is 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. Then we're going to work to press the seam allowances open. We don't need to finish any of this with an overlock or a serger because all of this is going to be hidden once we've attached our hem facing onto our garment. Press under the top edge of the hem facing by your seam allowance. Mine is 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. The top edge is the narrower part. Now I've pressed under the 1 centimetre 3/8 seam allowance all the way around the top edge of my hem facing. Take your garment and hem facing and match the right sides of the material together, aligning the front hem facing to the front garment and the back hem facing to the back garment. The raw edges of the hem of the garment and the hem of the facing should be matching. The folded edge of the hem facing will be sitting higher up the skirt. Make sure that you match the side seam of the dress with the side seam of the hem facings. You can use a clover fork pin here if you want to. Keep the lining out of the way whilst you're attaching this. At the sewing machine, you're going to be sewing the hem facing onto the exterior material using your 1 centimetre 3/8 seam allowance. You will sew this in a circle. I recommend starting at the centre back with a small back stitch, sewing all the way around and then finalising your stitch with another back stitch. Once the hemband has been attached to the bottom of the dress, we're going to complete an understitch. Push the seam allowances towards the hemband. Sew through the hemband, catching those seam allowances in the same manner that you would understitch a facing on a neckline. You can trim and grade your seam allowances if needed. I've just given the fraying edges of my seam allowance a quick trim. At the sewing machine, I'm using my edge stitching foot to allow me to sew nice and close to the join between the garment hem and the hem band. I've moved my needle a couple of places towards the hem band so that I'm stitching 2 to 3 millimeters away, a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch from the seam. I will start sewing at the centre back with a back stitch and sew the entire way around the hem band, making sure that I'm catching the seam allowances underneath as I complete this understitch. Press your work with the hem band facing up. You want to be able to see a small amount of the exterior dress at the hem before the join between the exterior and the hem band. Again, this is exactly the same as you would do for a neckline facing. Once you've pressed your hemband in position, you're then going to want to add some pins to the top edge of the hemband, the area that you previously pressed under, as we're going to be attaching the top edge of the hemband onto the dress next. It's really important that your hemband measures the same width from the hem to the top edge of the band, as we're going to be using the top edge of the band as a guide when sewing, and we want the stitching that will go through to the right side of your dress to be perfectly straight. Double check the size of the hemband and correct any discrepancies. At the sewing machine, you're going to want to use your edge stitching foot to sew nice and close to the top folded edge of your hemband. Move the needle a couple of places towards the hemband so that you're stitching the 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch, 2 to 3 millimeters away from the top folded edge of the hemband. Start sewing at the centre back or a side seam, complete a small back stitch and sew all the way around. Backstitch when you get back to the start. Next up, we're going to move to hem the lining. You're going to want to press a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, or whatever seam allowance you used for your lining, towards the wrong side of the lining. Complete this all the way around the lining hem. We're going to finish the lining with a double folded hem using the total 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch hem allowance. To do this, you're going to want to open up the hem allowance that you've pressed under. Fold the raw edge of the hem to the wrong side so that it meets the crease of the 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch hem allowance that you pressed under. Then fold the hem allowance in. This will give you a total hem width of 5 millimeters, a scant 1/4 of an inch. You can work to pin or press this in position all the way around your hem, or you can take your work to the sewing machine with simply the 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch hem allowance pressed. At the sewing machine, you can work to prepare the fabric into the double fold. You will be preparing this for a small section in front of the needle, whatever you feel comfortable with. Then you will sew that section. For sewing, I'm using my edge stitching foot with the needle moved one position towards the hem. Ideally, you want to be sewing a nice edge stitch, a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch, 2 to 3 millimeters away from the top folded edge of this hem. You will need to work to continue the steps of folding under and preparing your hem, then sewing that small section, then folding under and preparing the next section. When I'm preparing my fabric here, I will keep it quite taut, almost pulling against the presser foot. This helps to hold it into position as I'm about to sew it. You don't want to be pulling so much that you're stretching the fabric, you just want to be keeping it taut so that you're holding that hem in position prior to sewing. Once complete, I recommend giving the hem a press. Now that you have your hems complete, your exterior fabric and your lining, we're going to finalise the garment with a couple of extra steps. The first thing that we want to do is to anchor the lining and the exterior material together. This will create us a much more professional garment and will prevent the lining from moving about. One place I like to do this is beneath the underarm, near the bust dart. Working on the inside of your garment with the seam allowances going in the correct direction, match the lining to the exterior material, wrong sides together. We're going to be anchoring the seam allowances together at the base of the dart using a bar tack, a basic backwards and forward stitch. Before you take this to the sewing machine, it's a good idea to put a pin in, then turn your work around to the right side and check that everything is laying nice and flat. You don't want to cause any pulls or puckers here. Once happy, take your work to the sewing machine and sew a basic backwards and forward stitch 3 to 4 times to anchor this point in place. Complete this for both sides. If you would like, you're welcome to hand sew a hook and eye at the top of your invisible zipper. That will give you something that looks like this from the right side and this from the wrong side. The other additional step that you can take is to create a thread chain between the exterior garment and the lining at the hem. This is more useful on the longer length dress, and that's where I'm going to be applying it. I'm creating my thread chain about 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters down from the top edge of my hem band on the inside of my garment. I will do this on both side seams. I will make my thread chain about 4 to 5 centimeters long, 1.5 to 2 inches. I will then attach this thread chain onto my lining at the side seam. Do check when you attach this onto the lining that you're doing this in the right place. It can be a good idea to hang your dress inside out to see where the lining will fall in relation to this thread chain. Secure the thread chain on your lining side seam and you're left with something that looks like this. If you would like full instructions on how to create a thread chain, please see my corresponding tutorial, which I will link in the description box below.
Thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this class and that you learned some new construction techniques. In the next class, I'm going to be showing you a different method for sewing an inseam pocket. A slightly more professional method where the pocket stays towards the front of the garment. I hope to see you then.